Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome again to the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival, the 2021 Summer Series. Thank you so much for coming and your support of the series. We are very pleased to bring back in-person events, but mindful that risks remain, we are taking precautions and keeping all events outside, having only ticketed entry, limiting the crowd size, avoiding book signings, requiring vaccinations, and clearing out the tents between events. So when this panel is over, we'll ask you to step out for a little bit. Water is available throughout the day. There's a water cooler at the back of this tent and one over at the welcome check-in info tent. And please buy the author's books at the book tent if you did not already purchase them with your ticket. This is how we support our authors, the programming, and independent booksellers. Books are pre-signed this year with book plates. The authors will take questions from the audience at the end of the discussion, so when asking a question, please line up at one of the microphones over there and over there in the aisle, and please ask direct questions rather than making long statements so others have a chance to ask questions as well. So I will introduce you to our moderator. This panel is Mothers and Daughters, and the moderator is Dawn Davis. Dawn Davis was appointed as editor-in-chief of Bon Appétit in fall of 2020. In her role, Davis is responsible for the editorial vision of Bon Appétit and Condé Nast food brands across digital, video, social, and print platforms. Davis was formerly vice president and publisher of 37 Inc., an imprint of Simon & Schuster. She is an award-winning publisher and storytelling advocate who, for over 2 decades, has championed and elevated underrepresented voices. Her interest in food and restaurants also led her to write If You Can Stand the Heat, Tales from Chefs and Restaurateurs, which profiled some of the most dynamic and prolific chefs of the time, including Edna Lewis, Bobby Flay, Anthony Bourdain, Michael McCarty, Patricia Williams, and Linda Rodriguez. She was named the 2019 Editor of the Year by Poets and Writers, a former board member of the Harlem School of the Arts and a graduate of Stanford University. She lives in New York City with her family. She's a valued member of the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival Advisory Board. So, Dawn, over to you.
Is it just stand or?
You can do it right from there because I'm going to move this back so everybody can see you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here today. I'm a veteran of this festival, and one of the things I love about Martha's Vineyard is how much this island cares about books and literature. So I'm pleased to start by introducing the panelists. The first one's a little personal for me, Sadeqa Johnson. The notes say, we do not have many novelists at this year's book festival, but after reading Sadeqa Johnson's Yellow Wife, we were compelled to invite her to discuss her latest book. Yellow Wife is a harrowing tale rooted in history of an enslaved woman in Virginia beginning in the 1850s. Sadeqa has written 4 other novels. Her accolades include the National Book Club Award and the USA Best Book Award for Best Fiction. I am so pleased. I worked on Yellow Wife, so while the notes say we were compelled, the truth is I pressed the book into Sue Ellen Lazarus's hands. But I pressed many books into her hands, and she does not do what you say. She does what she thinks is best, and she fell in love with this book, as I hope you will too. Sadeqa. Next is Torrey Peters. For the past few years, Torrey has been a part of the trans literary movement based on trans people sharing their work among each other without barriers. She is also the author of the novellas Inflect Your Friends and Loved Ones and The Masker. Torrey Peters is the author of the critically acclaimed novel Detransition, a national bestseller. Detransition Baby was published by One World, a division of Random House, and was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. Arthur Garth Greenwell called the book, quote, the smartest novel I've read in ages. I wish I could figure out how it manages to be utterly savage and lacerating while also conveying endlessly expanding compassion. It's kind of a miracle. Torrey. Thank you. Deesha Philyaw, to my right. Her debut story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, won the 2021 PEN Faulkner Award for Fiction, the 2020-21 Story Prize, and the 2020 Los Angeles Times Book Prize. That's a lot of prizes. And it was also a finalist for the National Book Award. The Secret Lives of Church Ladies focuses on Black women, sex, and the Black church, and is being adapted for television by HBO Max's with Tessa Thompson producing. Amazing. So why don't we start, Sadeqa, we'll start with you, and why don't you tell us with a few sentences, if you will, what the book is about and the genesis of the book, if you can kind of condense that for us.
Absolutely. Well, first I just want to say thank you guys all so much for being here. I know you can be at the beach because it's a beautiful day, but we are so glad that you are here with us. As Dawn mentioned, I'm Sadeqa Johnson, and I'm the author of Yellow Wife. And Yellow Wife is the story of Phoebe Dolores Brown. She's a 17-year-old mulatto girl living on the Bell Plantation in Charles City, Virginia. She's the daughter of the master of the plantation, along with his favorite enslaved woman, Ruth, who is the medicine woman and also the seamstress. Well, Phoebe has been promised freedom her whole entire life. It's something she's always known. Her father has always said that when she turns 18, she'll be free and she'll go to a school in Massachusetts. Well, a series of unfortunate events happen to Phoebe, and she finds herself thrust into the world of slavery, in the bowels of slavery, where she ends up at the Lumpkins Jail, which is a holding center and punishing site for enslaved people. There she meets the jailer, she catches his eye, and she has to outwit him, not only for herself, but for all of the people who she cares for. And that's Yellow Wife.
Thank you.
I'm Torrey Peters. I echo, thank you all for being here instead of the beach. My book is called Detransition, Baby, and it's the protagonist is a trans woman living in Brooklyn in her 30s, and the action of the story kicks off when her ex, named Ames, who's a trans woman who detransitioned, gets then his boss pregnant. Her name's Katrina, and then proposes to Reese that they raise the baby together as an unconventional family with the three of them. And I'll just say that's just the first chapter. So it goes from there.
Sounds like a beach read to me.
Hello, thank you, echoing Sadeqa, for having us here. And I'm Deesha Philyaw. I'm the author of The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, which is a collection of 9 short stories that looks at the lives of 4 generations of Black Southern women, and looking at the ways that these women grapple to get free of the church's restrictions, hypocrisy, double standards, anything that's holding us back. And all of the characters are not church ladies. Some of them are what I call church lady adjacent. There is a woman in their life who is a church lady who is influential for better or for worse.
Wow. I've read the books and I want to read them again based on those descriptions. So this panel is about mother and daughters, and I'll start with you. We'll go the reverse this time. Tell me about the extent to which the mother-daughter relationship or mother-daughter relationships are the emotional center of your book, or is that just kind of for convenience of the panel you were put here?
No, so as I was pulling together these 9 stories, I had that theme running through my head like a drum beat: Black women, sex, the Black church. And literally right after I hit send on the manuscript and sent it off to the publisher, I thought, wow, there's a lot of mother-daughter stuff in this collection. 6 of the 9 stories, that's a prominent part of the relationships that are depicted. And that was really subconscious. I lost my mother to breast cancer in 2005. That was the defining relationship of my life. And when she passed away, we made peace. We said the things we wanted to say. But a lot can happen in a decade or so. And there were other things, I think, unfinished business that showed up in my stories that I wasn't even aware of. So it was by accident. But I got on this panel, so it worked out.
Writing as catharsis, maybe.
Yes.
Mother-daughter relationships are at the heart of mine, but maybe not as you think of them in a sort of conventional sense. There's sort of two ways it happens. One is I was curious about what does it mean for trans women to be mothers, and is there a place in sort of the nuclear family for trans women? And the way I explored it was in two senses. One is there's a trans woman who desperately wants to be a mother. She wants to raise a baby. And then and the question is how does that work for her and what family? And then the other thing is that amongst trans women, our relationships with each other are oftentimes maternal, in which there are older trans women and then there are younger trans women who transition. They don't know how to live a lot of times. They don't know where to find resources. Sometimes they don't know how to dress, all sorts of things that they need someone else to help them kind of be raised, even though they're sometimes 30 years old and they definitely don't want to be told what to do. But those relationships, we call them mother-daughter relationships in sort of the trans community. And so the question for the main character, Reese, is the difference between being a mother in a biological sense or in a family sense, and the ways that the maternal relationships happen within the book, or in the community, sorry.
When I was thinking of the story Yellow Wife, the very first scene that popped in my head, I'd done research on the book. Yellow Wife is loosely inspired by Mary Lumpkin, and she was an enslaved woman who I discovered while walking the slave trail in Richmond, Virginia. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I just happened to move to Richmond, which is a long story, and I'll tell you guys that later. But I happened to be on the Richmond slave trail by accident, and I discovered her story, and she was married to a white man who owned the jail. She was described as a black woman, and she was described as a woman who had 5 children with him. And while he was horrible in every sense of the word, they said on the caption that he treated his wife and his children with kindness. And he was described as one of the most despicable men on earth. And I thought, what was it like for Mary Lumpkin? What was that like for her? Was this a marriage of love? Was it a marriage of survival? And what was it like for those 5 children? In Virginia, I live on 3/4 of an acre. And when I was reading about the Lumpkins jail, which is what the story is loosely inspired on, it was a 1/2 acre of land. And on the 1/2 acre, it was their house. It was the jail in which fellow enslaved people were being tortured and punished, and families were being separated. And then there was the tavern. And I kept wondering, what did Mary tell her children? When families were being separated and this was happening in their own backyard, how did she explain that to them? And that was kind of the nucleus of the story kind of taking hold of me. And when I started to write the story under Phoebe Dolores Brown, the very first scene that came to my mind was Phoebe and her mother. And they were in the loom house where they lived, and her mother was whispering stories to her. She was whispering recipes, things that she didn't want Phoebe to forget. And it was such an intimate, strong moment of mother passing down healing and strength to her daughter that I thought, wow, this is exactly where the story needs to begin. And it was just that constant theme that ran through the story. I also felt my grandmothers as I was writing the story, more so than my mother, but I felt their energy and just the energy of women, of our ancestors who didn't really get a chance to tell their story, that no one gave them license or space. And so it was really important for me to incorporate that in Yellow Wife.
I actually have questions for all of you. I'll actually start with you, Torrey. One line that early on in the novel that stuck out for me was, I think you write something along the lines of the notion of unconditional maternal love falls short in the trans community, which was really piercing. I'd love for you to talk to that a little bit.
Well, I think that that was from the point of view of Reese, the woman who wanted to be a mother. And part of it is that I think she has a grass is greener sort of mentality. Like, I think that she's someone for whom she felt very much like, this is my world, the queer community. And that in some ways, like, when you're living in a queer community and there's scarcity and not that many people have jobs, like, you can't always be there for other people. Like, you let people down, things fall apart, and she felt let down a lot by other trans women. And so she had this idea that, like, well, if I could actually have, she saw sort of like everything that's in the media, all these sort of depictions of motherhood that she felt weren't available to her, and if she could only have, if she could have a baby that she could raise, that would love her, that wasn't with like all of the complications and difficulty of like trying to make it like in Brooklyn in this like trans world, it would save her. And so I think she had this like romanticized idea that it would save her, and that was her point of view. I think that hopefully, well, I don't want to give away the end of the book, but hopefully she learned something, somewhere in the book. And so, but I do think, I related to it myself, that when I was in my 30s, once, I just turned 40, so 3 weeks ago, I had this sense that, I was looking to a lot of cis women around me, and I was looking to see how they found meaning in their 30s. And, a lot of them turned to motherhood to find meaning, and it wasn't available to me. And I had to sort of go through a process, seeing what all these other women I knew did, to basically be like, is there meaning there, or am I romanticizing it? Would having a child save me in the way that Reese thinks, it would make meaning for my life? And part of why I wrote Reese was to work through that emotionally for myself and for my friends who couldn't have children.
That's beautiful. Deesha, you're writing about the relationships between mothers and daughters. As you mentioned, 6 of the 9 short stories in this collection deal with the mother-daughter relationship. But you're also writing about the relationship between people in the church and out of the church, the relationship between people in the church and their God, their priest, their minister. And, you're looking at the hypocrisy and the rhetoric. Mm-hmm. So talk to me about how you came to that. I find that riveting and very entertaining.
Initially, 20 years ago, I started writing about church ladies, except I didn't think of it that way. I thought I was writing about dissatisfied women because I was dissatisfied at that time, but I didn't have the confidence or the courage to write nonfiction about myself. So I had these challenges and these fears and these disappointments and this dissatisfaction. But what was living in my nostalgia and in my imagination were the church women of my youth. And I was so curious about them when I was growing up, how they dressed, how they carried themselves. And then as I was becoming an adolescent and sort of figuring out this whole womanhood question, I would look at them and I knew all the rules, and I was like, did they have sex? Did they like sex? Did they masturbate? Things you couldn't ask Black Southern church women. But it stayed with me. And so when I created this space for myself, I was a stay-at-home mom at the time and had a kid who didn't nap, and that 30 minutes a day was when I could write. And I had my own dissatisfaction, and then I had these memories of these women and the questions I had about them, and it all just kind of collided. And then, of course, as an adult myself, and now seeing the church from an outsider perspective, and looking back and seeing the hypocrisy, and the rules just weren't like confusing. When you're a kid, it's like, well, wait, everybody who's having fun and wearing, tight jeans, they're going to hell? Like, I want to wear tight jeans, but I don't want to go to hell. So, that's a child's eyes view. But then as an adult, I was able to then, see more depth and see more of how harmful the church can be and has been for so many women. I feel like I was spared some of that. But I wondered about the women I watched growing up who, perhaps went decades without being touched, without having any kind of sexual intimacy. What is that like? And, who would make that choice? And how would they secretly get around these restrictions? What might that look like? So it was those kinds of questions and curiosity that drove it for me.
I love that. And Sadeqa, you opened by talking about the relationship between Phoebe, who's the main character, and her mother, who was teaching her recipes and medicinal, practices that she would later on use. But you also talk about the relationship between Phoebe and her children, and without giving away the novel, in many ways, the novel is her attempt to save her children from some of the horrors she herself witnessed. So you have kind of multiple mother-daughter relationships in the book, and I'm wondering how you tonally made them different in the book. How did you go about that?
I have 3 children of my own, and when I was writing Phoebe's relationship with her children, it was very easy for me to draw on that experience. What would I feel like as an enslaved woman who was suffering and didn't have any agency and couldn't make choices for myself? What would that be like in the relationship? Particularly, I have well, I shouldn't give too much away, but I have a son, and Phoebe has a son. That's not telling you too much. But when I'm listening to the news and I'm seeing the things that Black and brown boys are going through with the police and, everything that happened last summer, it's like I could feel that, and I could feel that in the story that I was trying to tell, because this was something that's been happening for generations and generations and generations. And so I was able to draw from my own personal experience with raising children, and then being informed by the world and how it is for mothers who, we'll move into a neighborhood that we don't necessarily like, but we'll do it for the school district because we want our kids to have better than we have. And so that was always kind of going through my head as I was writing the story, is that as mothers, we constantly make sacrifices for our children. And so it was very natural for Phoebe to do some of the things that she did in the book for her children.
Yeah, I will say, I'm obviously biased, but don't give it away, because this book, the pages turn themselves. And one of the things, we would send books out for blurbs, and we would get blurbs 2 days later, which in my 20 years of publishing, it's really more than that, but I say 20 because if I say the real number, it'll make me crazy. We just got tons and tons of blurbs. I want to talk now about your kind of metaphorical mothers. Who influenced you as writers? Are there any? They don't have to be women, but are there any women writers in particular who, are the North Star for you, or whose spirit can be felt in this book? We'll start with you, Torrey.
I think the women writers who sort of showed me how to do this were a bunch of trans women in Brooklyn. I was part of this trans writing scene in Brooklyn in around 2013, and the idea of it was trans women writing for each other, imagining other trans women as an audience. And it's sort of similar to Toni Morrison writing for other Black women, that when you write for other trans women, you don't slow down to explain anything. It can be 100% story instead of stopping to be like, here's what this word means or something. And the other thing that happens is when you write for other trans women, it sets the bar higher, that if I was to talk about hormones or kind of other things that lots of times I can get, with typical audiences, I can get a good reaction from. If I say to trans women, here's how to do hormones, they'll yawn in my face. And that's actually good, to imagine an audience that's gonna yawn in my face unless I really bring it. So when I thought about who actually showed me how to write, I was imagining, actual women that I know who would usually yawn in my face, and I could just see them, and they showed me not only how to write, but part of how to write was how to live, and I'm really grateful for them.
That's lovely. Deesha, what about you?
So usually when I get a question like this, I say Toni Morrison, because she writes unapologetically about Black life, and that's what I wanted to do. She writes about bold Black women who don't always follow societal rules and expectations. But I was just finishing up an essay this morning and sort of remembering that really the seed was planted by Louise Merriweather in her book, Daddy Was a Number Runner, which I started reading in elementary school, and I reread that book over and over all the way through high school. And it is a Black girl coming of age story set in Harlem in 1934. And there's so many things I could say about that book, but to your question, what it did is it said that Black girl stories are worthy of being centered, being at the center of our own stories, which sort of sounds like a no-brainer, but it's not. Because if you think about how many stories about Black folks we're not centered because there's a white savior trope or something like that. But in 1970, Louise Merriweather is writing this coming-of-age novel about a black girl living in the wake of the Great Depression. And that was a reminder for me that our stories are worthy and we're worthy of being centered in them.
I love that. For this panel, festival, got to interview Jessica Harris, who wrote the book that became High on the Hog, the Netflix documentary, but she talks about being friends with Louise Merriweather and James Baldwin and, you know, all of that, so beautiful. What about you?
So my first thought was B.B. Moore Campbell, because she was a writer who also grew up in Philadelphia and actually was the first person to introduce me to the Vineyard. Was my first time here was as a teenager because of her. And she really showed me what it took to be a writer. She was dedicated and she was serious. And I remember her just kind of like, I had asked her to read a portion of something I was writing, and she said to me, she said, Sadeqa, I would really love to support you at this moment. I can't have anybody else's story in my head. And that really showed me like there has to be boundaries to it. Like when you're working on a book, you have to be like tunnel vision all in. And that was something that she had given me at 16. But when I was younger, I would say Maya Angelou, you know, I was reading her autobiographies in school and I was so into them. My friends would steal my books because they were like, would you get your head out of the book and come outside and jump double dutch with us, you know? So she was like one of the first ones. And then when I read Terry McMillan's Mama, it changed my life. To see Frida, it was like the first time I saw myself on the page. And it was the first time I read a book twice. And so it was that early, just being a reader, I think, as a child, being someone who couldn't be separated from books definitely fueled me. And I found motherhood in all of those authors who fostered me as a reader.
So I'm going to ask another question, and then we have some time for questions. I believe that there's a mic over there and a mic over there. So prepare for questions as we maybe give short answers to this next question. One of the things, and I'll start with you, Sadeqa, is that you all write complicated characters. So the jailer you mentioned, Yellow Wife, is based on the true story of the Lumpkin jail, and it was known as the Devil's Half Acre. He was notoriously, in a world in which cruelty was the norm. He was particularly cruel. And yet he is complicated in the book. He is, he's not flat. All of you have characters who, Ames you could be upset at from page 1, but you manage to, understand and empathize. And, Peach Cobbler, I love that story. Peach Cobbler, perfect during peach season. Go get those Gold Bud peaches from Up Island and pay $6 a peach. We can do this. But in Peach Cobbler, the preacher is, he's also complicated. So as a writer, tell us how you manage to write people who are not necessarily likable on the surface, but you kind of endow them with some humanity. I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I do it by showing them the grace that I hope people would show me in being flawed. I think about the mother in Peach Cobbler. That story is one that was rejected a lot by editors. And whenever they told me why they were rejecting it, they said, we just don't get this mother. What mother would act this way? And so I thought, it's important for me to make sure that we just don't see her, as you said, as flat, as demonized. And so there are moments when we understand why she does what she does, but an explanation is not absolution, And so I think sometimes I try to add those layers, as you said, so they're not flat, but that does not necessarily absolve.
Wonderful.
I think I found my voice in dislikable characters. Like it was through dislikable characters that I was able to find what I wanted to express, and that's because I think I was very afraid of respectability, that I was supposed to like represent trans women, and there was a burden to that, so that every time I had any characters, I'd be like, well, this character is dislikable. They can't represent trans women, and when I was basically like, no, this is a dislikable character. They're going to do messy things that you're not going to agree with, and that trans women themselves are not going to be like, I see myself in that character necessarily. Like, you know, they're definitely like, that's your thing, Torrey, not us. And that when I had that kind of freedom to have a dislikable character, I could write these full characters. I could empathize with them. I could see where they went wrong and why they went wrong. And I think if I didn't write characters who were messy and dislikable, they wouldn't come out full.
For me, it was actually really tricky writing the jailer in the book because he is so notoriously cruel. I had to find a layer of humanity in him, and it had to come through love. So I had to pull back different layers of his personality and try and get to the essence of who he was. Who was he before he was, you know, a slave trader? Like, who was he at his core? Who was he as a child? And just kind of opening him up and trying to see, like, inside of his heart made it a little bit easier. But he was flat for the first couple of drafts. It took maybe 5 drafts before I hit the stride of like who he was. And then it was a matter of kind of towing the line between good and bad and love and hate. And it was complicated. But once I got a groove, it started to fall in place for me.
I don't see anyone at the mics, but I have another question, unless I see someone heading to the mic. Mm-hmm. And then I'll try to sneak in my question.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. I'm just curious about your own relationships with your mothers.
I'll go first. Gosh, that hurt my heart a little bit. I was like, oh. So my relationship with my mother is complicated, to say the least. We had, you know, she loves me, and that really is what it matters. And as a mother now, I could see that we're doing the best that we can in that moment, because I'm sure my kids are gonna need like therapy in 5 years, and I think I did the best job possible, you know? And I think that's what I'm learning about my mother as an adult. As a child, I was like, oh, she is not the person who I need her to be. She's not where I need her to be. She's not doing what I need her to be. Why can't I have Felicia Rashad off The Cosby Show? And I'll just leave it at that.
I also would call my relationship with my mother complicated. I'm grateful for all that she did. I think she had a hard time understanding the choices that I made, and that we have different ways of seeing the world, which resulted in different values. But I respect what she did for me, and you know, we go in and out of periods of being close and sometimes not talking. But one of the things I like is a more expansive view of motherhood, that you actually don't only get one mother. And so you can have mothers on TV, you can have mothers amongst your friends, you can have mothers in a lot of different ways. And in that sense, I have a lot of mothers, and a lot of mothers who both take care of me and occasionally tell me, you know, when I'm messing up. And same with my biological mother. I'm grateful for all of them.
I love that story.
So my relationship with my mom was very difficult. As I mentioned, you know, she passed away in 2005, but I miss her every day. And one of the things that happened after she died is something that I hope happens for everybody, which is I started to see my mother as a person and not just as my mother. And she had me when she was 18. And when my oldest daughter turned 18, I burst into tears when I thought about, oh wait, I can't even imagine my child having a child, and thinking, okay, all that happened, she did that as a teenager, and there was never a moment when I wasn't absolutely loved and cared for. So despite everything, that's true.
I have to say, as a former book publisher, I have 2 children, and I always, when we're fighting, I always tell myself, you've never edited a memoir or a novel, or, you know, in which the mother-child relationship is not fraught, and that this too shall pass, or you will get over it, or you will come to an understanding, or what they say right now is not necessarily going to last forever. So it is a complicated thing. We have more questions? Yeah. That was a great question. Thank you.
So this panel is called Mothers and Daughters, not Parents and Children. And I'm interested in hearing what you guys think the role that gender plays in this relationship, because it can be so complicated. On the one hand, there are women who feel very strongly about the fact that they are mothers, and that's different from being a parent. We have different societal expectations. We have, all the data show that mothers do a whole lot more work around the house than fathers, right? But at the same time, we are looking for liberation from what's oppressive in that and questioning whether these, gender binaries even make sense at all. So yeah, I just wanted to hear what you guys thought of the role of womanhood, I guess, in the parent and child relationship that we're talking about.
I can start with that. Because one of the things I wanted to say earlier was that it's significant that mothers and daughters show up in my stories, in particular around religion, because mothers transmit culture and religion in ways that fathers don't. That's part of that gendering. And so even when it's harmful, even when it's patriarchal, even when it's limiting, often we are learning it from our mothers. And so I think that's one way that it matters, and that's one way that it shows up in my stories, and I show characters trying to grapple with that kind of unlearning.
I think about this a lot in terms of the mother relationship as a metaphorical thing, where oftentimes mothers create daughters who they expect to be like them. Fathers don't expect their daughters to be like them, but sometimes fathers expect their sons to be like them. And so in that you should be like me kind of thing creates a whole lot of tensions that are specific to motherhood, kind of hidden competition or disappointment if you turn out different than your mother, if your daughter makes different decisions than you make. And so there's a whole series, I think, of dynamics in the way that you perform that gender, and the way that ends up oftentimes inflecting or influencing or even threatening the mother or the daughter, that don't necessarily show up when those relationships of parenting and being a child are cross-gender.
I think in the story Yellow Wife, Phoebe had a lot of mothers. And so she had her biological mother, which someone in the story says, you're lucky to have even known your mother, because those relationships were often separated. And so she was lucky to have that mother, but then she was mothered by the woman who took care of the house and the woman who took care of the kitchen. So she always constantly had someone else that she can turn to that would give her instruction. And I think for enslaved people, it was definitely a little bit different because, it's that drop of blood, the black blood, and most of that came from the mother. And so she was necessarily going to be an enslaved woman because her mother was an enslaved woman. And so there was certain things that her mom had to teach her to prepare her so that when she went out into the world, she knew certain things. One of the things that I love is her mother would tell her, you're a slave in name, but never in your mind. And that was something that Phoebe carried with her throughout the story, and something that she passed on to her own children was that you're a slave in name, but never in your mind. And that gave her a sense of freedom that she wouldn't necessarily have if it wasn't for her mother.
Thank you. Is there another question? So I'll ask a question. You all have had interesting journeys to being published. I know that you, Sadeqa, self-published in the beginning. Torrey, I believe you did as well. And the moment found you and you were ready. And then you were published by a university press, this collection of stories that went on. You're an international bestseller, Sadeqa. You're a national bestseller. You've all won prizes. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your journeys to these particular books.
Sure. So I started off, my background was actually in publishing. So I was a publicist for a number of years. I worked on the first 3 Harry Potter books at Scholastic, so all of my books are autographed. That's like my pride and joy. The kids can't touch them. They're on the highest level in my bookshelf. But I thought it was going to be easy because I had a background in publishing. So I was writing every day on the train, and I was closing my door every day at 4 o'clock, working on this novel. I had my son and told my husband, I was like, I'm going to stay home. I'm going to be a New York Times bestseller. I'm going to sell this book, and the rest is history. Well, I got an agent. She wasn't able to sell my book, and I was distraught. So we had to put our heads together and figure out, well, what are we going to do next? Are we going to sit in the corner and cry? Because that's really what I wanted to do. Or are we going to put on our big girl pants and make something happen? So I had to use everything that I learned in publishing to start a small press. And it was not easy. When they say self-publishing, it is all self. So I would call up bookstores and pretend to be the sales manager. And I would use my maiden name. My friends call me Dee. So I'd say, like, hi, this is Dee Murray calling from 12th Street Press. I got this great book for you. You know, could I send you a couple of copies? And it worked. You know, they say, yeah, send me a few copies. We booked ourselves at every single book festival up and down the East Coast. I was at the Harlem Book Festival in like 92 degrees, sweating my makeup off, begging people to buy my first novel. And it worked. I sold 82 copies of the book that day. And we thought, okay, if we could reach people just by going out into the street, eventually has to catch fire. And it did. I won the Phyllis Wheatley Award. My editor for my first novel then became my agent, and she went to the publishing houses again with my second novel, and I went from the girl who nobody wanted to publish to having 3 offers on the table. And if I can impart anything, and anyone who wants to be a writer out there today, that this is not for the faint of heart. This is not a short game. This is a long haul, and you really have to put everything into it.
Yeah, I really admire the way that all of us here have been working at this for a while. My own story was that because I was part of this trans writing scene out of Brooklyn, where we prioritize trans audiences, when we went to like publishing companies, they were like, trans audiences, like what's that, like 1.01% of the population, like who's going to buy this? And so as a result, we were like, well, we think this is important. We think it shapes the aesthetics of the books. So we're just going to publish it ourselves, and we're not going to worry about the publishing companies. And so there was a press in Brooklyn that we started that we were out publishing for each other. And the whole thing kind of imploded. You know, when a lot of people have scarcity in their lives and they're trying to make things meet, and there's only one press, and there's only a certain amount of work, it creates a lot of infighting. So the scene kind of imploded around this press, and there was a lot of acrimony. And so I had this idea that, all right, I'm gonna take the skills that we had with the press, and I'm gonna write these little novellas to illustrate, here's how you can write a novella. And I'm gonna say that any trans girl who wants can have access to my Adobe account, to InDesign. Here's how to typeset a book. We'll all just publish books amongst each other, and it was very ideological, kind of dreamy that I had. But in the end, I published 2 novellas to prove that this was going to happen. And nobody took me up on my offer, to be honest. I think that people wanted the imprimatur of a press. But what happened in the intervening years between when I published those 2 novellas is that they became sort of these cult favorites in Brooklyn. They started getting passed around hand to hand, and they had their own reputation. And then just as I was finishing this novella, it turned out that reputation reached the publishing companies that had rejected wanting exactly that aesthetic 5-7 years earlier. And they were like, and this time, because I had this audience, I had the reputation, they let me publish the book, not entirely on my terms, but in the way that I said would work, and they believed me.
Love that.
I had an agent from my co-parenting book, which I wrote with my ex-husband, and she managed my expectations when it came to the short story collection. And there were certain things that she told me that, people tell writers all the time, short story collections do not sell. And it was a debut. It's a little tiny book. I didn't have a lot of expectations for the book. And when we, she sent it out, we just started collecting the rejections from all of the big publishers. And but what I like to tell writers is all you need is one yes. That's it. You just need one yes. And my one yes came from West Virginia University Press. They were enthusiastic about the book. It was also a lesson in how all of this is very subjective. There were some rejections that I got that was like, this needs way too much work. And honestly, it did not need a lot of work. It was not heavily edited when it was in-house at West Virginia University Press. It's a matter of taste in some cases, or timing, or magic, or luck, or whatever. But you just need that one yes. And so I'm hoping that the success of this book changes the conversation around short stories, because they do sell. My collection was not the only one last year that was well received. So sometimes something different happens, and publishing responds. You know how it goes.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. We actually have to wrap up, but we'll just do one rapid fire round. I know what I've loved. What social media has allowed authors to do is to support each other and to bypass. When I first got into publishing, it was NPR, it was the New York Times, and People magazine. And if you didn't get one of those, if you got all three, you were going to be a bestseller, or you were going to get a lot of critical acclaim. But if you didn't get those, you were kind of, out. So what I love is how much you authors are supporting each other online. You are always posting about other books and other authors and books you've enjoyed. So I'd love for you each to say right now what book you are in love with, or we'll read next.
I'll start with what I just finished, which was The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Harris, which, because I worked in publishing, oh my gosh, it ripped off all kinds of Band-Aids and wounds that I thought were okay. So that's what I just got finished reading. I actually have the wonderful fortune now that I get to read books before they come out. So I'm currently reading Carolina Built by an author for a book that's coming out next year.
I always talk about this book, Time is a Thing That a Body Moves Through, by T. Fleischman, which is on Coffee House Press, which is a smaller press. And it's a book that it's by a non-binary author who's just got like an incredibly beautiful way of not only using words, but of seeing the world. And it's a book that I know I'll be able to read 10 years from now and be as moved as I was every other time that I've read it.
I finished reading one of Dawn's books, Yonder by Jabari Asim. Got an advanced copy of that. And I just got my hands on Gail Jones's book, which is her first book in 20 years. And I hope I get the title right, Palmares or Palmeras, do you know?
I don't know.
Oh, okay, all right. But it's her first novel in 20 years.
I did not cue that question up. Sue Ellen, did you hear that though? You guys have been such a great audience. I want to thank you all. Sadeqa Johnson, Yellow Wife is amazing. Yes. The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, Deesha Philyaw. You should get this. They're both such quick reads. And this, you heard the plot. It's such a great read. Detransition, baby, Torrey Peters. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.